I want to welcome everyone. First off, let me remind everyone to please turn off all mobile communication devices. I want to mention some upcoming events. Next Monday at noon, Nina Ognyanova, who is Program Coordinator for Europe and Central Asia with the Committee to Protect Journalists, will speak about why the murder of Russian journalists matters beyond Russia. Then, obviously, we may have a government shutdown. The Wilson Center will continue to function with its trust employees. Some of us won't be here, some of us will. I think if we get to that, one can assume that some entrances to the building may close up because there aren't enough security people, but the building will be open and the events that are scheduled will go on. And that's important because Monday, March 7th, David Katz, who is with the Litvaks Studies Institute in Vilnius, is going to speak about Holocaust revisionism, ultranationalism, and Nazi-Soviet double genocide, the debate over Nazi-Soviet double genocide in Eastern Europe. This is one of the most controversial events that we've had in years, and there already have been people who have expressed very strong opinions about it. So if you're interested in that subject, it will take place whether or not the government is open, and you might want to get here a little bit on the early side that day because it should be very, very lively. Then on Friday, March 11th, not on Tuesday as the calendar said, it's a Friday, at 9 a.m., Ella Pamfilova, who's former chair of the Russian Presidential Council for the Promotion of Civil Society and Human Rights, will speak. And we have other events coming up as well. Well, Regine, I don't welcome her because she's been here for a while. She's a Title VIII research scholar here with us this year. It's been to our advantage to have her here, as you are about to discover if you don't know her. She's well worth hearing and listening to and talking with. She was educated at Stanford University, where she earned a bachelor's and a master's degree, and then she moved to the other side of the Bay and earned another master's and her PhD in political science at the University of California at Berkeley. She has taught at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and in addition to being here, she's had a number of very prestigious grants, probably every important grant in our field. She's been a research fellow at the Institute for International Studies at Berkeley. And I actually think there's a category of people who often get overlooked in our field but are terribly important, and they're interns. And she was Fiona Hill's intern. So Brookings interns, Wilson Center interns have great careers in front of them, and Regine is proof of that. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you to you and the rest of the Kennan Institute for hosting me this year, as well as to the Title VIII program for funding my year this year, as well as previous dissertation research. I'll be talking today about my book manuscript project this year as a visiting research scholar, and it's based on a few years of research in Central Asia between 2005 and 2007 primarily. I'll first introduce the core question driving my research and provide background on why Kyrgyzstan and the bazaar sector in particular are interesting and relevant sites for my work. I'll then put forth an answer to my main question and elaborate on the implications of my analysis, both for Kyrgyzstan's contemporary politics and economy. So the core question that I address is this idea that in the developing world, business and property owners face significant challenges securing their property, and the post-Soviet region is no exception. Upon the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, many of these new countries undertook reforms that rapidly transferred formal ownership rights from the state to the private sector, while simultaneously taking steps to write new constitutions and create new rules of the political game. Many post-Soviet countries in this process experienced asset stripping, insider privatization, and property conflicts in the absence of a strong Weberian state possessing independent and reliable administrative, legal, regulatory, and enforcement institutions. In environments such as these, property is often subject to asset grabbing, expropriation, and other non-consensual modes of redistribution. And indeed, cycles of post-Soviet property struggles over the past 2 decades have continued as political and economic environments have changed. And even when property rights have been formally legislated on paper, they're not necessarily implemented or recognized in practice. The question I pose is how businessmen operate in these environments. Indeed, it would be inaccurate to suggest that all assets have undergone unwilling redistribution or expropriation in this region over the past 2 decades. In fact, some assets have been notably stable in this period, which leads to the following question. Why have some assets remained relatively secure in an environment characterized by weak rule of law and a continually changing economic and political environment? Let me briefly give a couple of examples of contrasting cases of bazaars in Kyrgyzstan. But first, a little bit more on Kyrgyzstan and why bazaars. So Kyrgyzstan is a small country in Central Asia bordering China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. It's primarily comprised of ethnic Kyrgyz with substantial Uzbek and Russian minorities. Over the past 5 years, and the past year in particular, it's been a particularly tumultuous and unstable period. In 2005, the country's first president, Askar Akayev, was overthrown, and 5 years later, in 2010, the second president was similarly deposed amid street violence. Just months later, in June of 2010, ethnic rioting erupted in the south of the country, leading to hundreds of deaths. By fall, the country had managed to hold a new referendum and a new constitution that limits the powers of the president, and new elections were held in October. By year's end, a new coalition government was formed after the first attempt failed. So this is a country in which property insecurity and cases of asset grabbing and forced sale of companies has characterized the economy since the country's inception. Conflicts range from murky privatizations of state-owned property, conflicts over agricultural land, and conflicts over residential land as squatters have flocked from urban areas to rural areas and from the south of the country to the north of the country. Tensions have escalated in particular in the 1990s as an expansionist and predatory presidential family sought to spread its tentacles in business, ultimately gaining control over a significant range of economic assets in the country. This trend escalated with President Akayev's son and son-in-law entering the business sphere in the late 90s. By 2005, everyone knew about Akayev's family business. And in the aftermath of Akayev's ouster, President Kurmanbek Bakiyev essentially continued the precedent that Akayev set. Members of the family acquired important stakes in business and government, and in Bakiyev's case, it was his brothers and his sons who were most prominent. Positions of Bakiyev's relatives include not only businessmen, but also ambassadorial posts and other government positions. The regime used threats of force and mustered administrative and bureaucratic resources to their favor, clearly signaling to all that it was their turn to reap the economic benefits of political power. This trend is indeed not unique to Central Asia. Other predatory presidential families have been in the news of late. For example, the recent case of Tunisia's deposed president, his wife, and what journalists have described as his rapacious family. And other historical families come to mind as well. For example, in the Philippines, the Marcos family. So among the assets that have been most contentious in Kyrgyzstan are the country's bazaars, or marketplaces. As the manufacturing and cattle rearing sectors declined in Kyrgyzstan in the early 90s, it was the trade sector, which takes place primarily at bazaars, that boomed throughout the 90s and 2000s. As of 2005, the trade sector comprised over 400 bazaars. Much of the country's wholesale bazaars serve customers in neighboring Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Russia. In fact, Kyrgyzstan has become a re-export hub for primarily Chinese-made goods to other Central Asian countries. And these goods include everything from clothing, textiles, other consumer products. I'd be happy to talk more about bazaars in particular in the question and answer if anyone wants to go into that further, but for now I'll just put the economic role of bazaars in broader perspective. in terms of the economy. So Kyrgyzstan receives hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid, hundreds of millions in gold export revenue, and hundreds of millions of dollars, even $1 billion as of 2008, in remittances sent home from migrants working in Kazakhstan and Russia. Trade turnover bazaars is in the billions of dollars, $3 to $4 billion annually, and that's likely an underestimate. So those who control bazaars have important access to revenue streams. And here I want to distinguish between the owners of bazaars and traders in bazaars. Traders form the horizontal network of local, regional, and transnational trade. That is, they import the goods from Turkey or China and sell them in the bazaars. Owners form the vertical rent extraction dimension of bazaars. That is, they own the land on which bazaars rent, the containers, the stalls, the pavilions, and they charge rents for both the containers as well as the land. And in post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan, it is not the traders who have independent political power, it's the owners of the bazaars that play a particularly important role in politics. And I'm going to be focusing on the owners for the remainder of this presentation. So thus far I've addressed the importance of the question of how businessmen secure property in this environment, and elaborated on why Kyrgyzstan and the bazaar sector are illuminating sites for answering this question. And I'll now move to the two contrasting cases I mentioned earlier. Let's take the case of the central retail bazaar in Bishkek, which typifies ongoing property redistributions in the country. When I visited the bazaar in 2005-2006, commerce appeared to be carrying on as usual. Yet behind the scenes, a struggle for ownership was underway. Since Kyrgyzstan's independence, multiple owners have collected rents from the bazaars, beginning originally with the Soviet-era directors of the marketplace, then a relative of the first President Akayev, and then a new set of directors that came in after Akayev's departure from politics, allegedly tied to President Bakiev. As one administrator of the bazaar reflected, President Akayev may have left, but the revolution is continuing in the form of property redistribution. This central bazaar, like the sprawling bazaar in Karasu in the south of the country, have been among the many assets embroiled in struggles over control at various times throughout the 90s and 2000s. This is a good example because it highlights two conventional wisdoms about property and politics in Kyrgyzstan. First, that the country has experienced and continues to experience waves of cycles of property redistribution. And second, that the presidential family, whether Akayev or Bakiev, has had its hand in business, including bazaars. Yet this is also an important exception for the following reason. While the presidential family has indeed controlled many assets in the country and many sectors, aside from this retail bazaar, many of the other important bazaars, including the wholesale bazaars, were not under direct control of these families. In fact, the main bazaars and important trade routes in the country were noticeably absent from discussions about the presidential family business. I have found that the liberalization of trade in the consumer goods sector, and the increasing importance of bazaars to the economy have been one of the crucial sources of relatively independent wealth in Kyrgyzstan. Hence the title of the talk, All in the Family? The answer is no. And again, let me give you an example from the bazaar sector. One of the most important wholesale bazaars is in the north of the country, Dordoy, outside of Bishkek, and it's not owned by a presidential family member. It's owned by Askar Salambekov and his family, among a couple of other owners, and it's one of the largest, as I said, with 6,000 to 7,000 containers, employing 20,000 to 30,000 people, and that's also likely an underestimate, so a city within a city. Official turnover at this bazaar, again, difficult to estimate, but in the hundreds of millions of dollars monthly. Again, as of last year, 2008. So the key question becomes, what explains the success of owners such as Salambekov and others in the bazaar sector and beyond? And what does this tell us about business-state relations and politics in Kyrgyzstan? So now on to the answer. Conventional explanations for how property can be secured focus on the state itself. That is, how the state can be transitioned from a roving bandit to a stationary bandit that collects taxes instead of extorting from the population. how the coercive powers of the state can be tamed so as not to disrupt or inhibit entrepreneurial activity, how institutions of the state, such as law enforcement bodies and courts, can be strengthened. These are state-centered approaches that focus on formal institutions of government. My study focuses more on the agency dimension and the choices businessmen have in this environment, in the absence of these clear state-centered reforms. What kind of choices can businessmen make? They can hide, they can stay in the shadows, they can move their businesses overseas entirely, they can hire users of violence, so mafias, to protect them, or they can more recently forge ties with foreign investors. Not necessarily or not only to gain access to foreign capital, as is commonly assumed, but also to obtain political and international support to fend off predatory threats by the state and other actors. These are all important strategies. My strategy elaborates on an additional, more political strategy that I have found businessmen have adopted in Kyrgyzstan and other parts of the post-Soviet region. That is, they form patronage bargains at two levels of society. First, businessmen form ties with officials, whether the president or other top officials. And second, they form linkages with societal groups, community organizations, and I'll discuss this more in a moment. This dual strategy of forging linkages both at the elite level and at society level, I argue, raises the cost of intervention in business holdings. So I find the extent to which property can be secured hinges on informal political and social relationships and institutions, as opposed to formal rule of law institutions. What are patronage and patron-client relations? Just briefly, they're an important formal institution in much of the developing world. Scott defines patron-client relations as consisting of a power figure who is in a position to give security, inducements, or both, and his followers, who in turn, for such benefits, contribute their loyalty and personal assistance to the patron's designs. In countries as diverse as Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, patronage systems have flourished and continue to define political systems and economic relationships despite liberalization and democratization trends over the past few decades. So my work thus fits into a range of studies that focus on how political and social relationships undergird property relations in all contexts, whether in more developed systems such as the US or in other parts of the developing world where, as we know, informal institutions play a particularly important role when state capacity is weak and there's significant political and economic transition. So let me elaborate on how these patronage bargains work in the case of Kyrgyzstan and Kyrgyzstan's bazaar owners. One important caveat to mention before proceeding about bazaar property. It's important to distinguish, in the context of the post-Soviet region in particular, between the acquisition of property and actually securing that property. My research on bazaar owners indicates that those who came to own the bazaars after independence were not members of the presidential family, nor were they members of the same clan, for example, as the president, or of one particular ethnicity, or even from one region. They transcended these categories, and in fact, they almost all had some form of personal relation or connection to the Akayev family directly. Over time, these personal relationships became mobilized into broader patronage relationships, according to the following logic. The president essentially allowed businessmen to continue their business and accumulate wealth, often also as deputies of parliament, which came with immunity from prosecution, in exchange for their financial and political support of presidential initiatives, including elections. Bazaar owners comprise an important subset of businessmen who accumulated wealth in the early to mid-90s and also held parliamentary seats. So if you look back over the history of the past 2 decades of members of parliament, at least a dozen members of parliament have had direct ownership stakes. And in the 2006 parliament, for example, 30% of the deputies had direct or indirect ties to bazaars. Another indicator, an investigation of the top 10 wealthiest people in Kyrgyzstan's parliament in 2008, reveals that half of them amassed and continued to accumulate wealth from stakes in the largest marketplaces in the country. So these new bazaar owners and businessmen solidified their ties to the presidential family, first through personal, then patronage bargains, often involving parliamentary positions. And they also nurtured and extended their relations to constituents and local groups. That is to say, they became patrons of their communities. They provided economic benefits, public goods, fellowships, other awards to increasingly impoverished and excluded members of their population. And these ties to the societal level functioned in different ways, and I'll just mention two right now. First, the businessmen would diversify their assets amongst their family members, for example, to their wives, but also to their children, so that in a certain sense they were legally free of their assets, and they could pursue high-level networking while other members of the family ran day-to-day operations. This was a hydro-like business structure, the way I like to think about it, and it posed more difficulty for authorities or others to take over such a business because it involves uprooting an entire family and an entire network, not just a particular person. So with various family members and relatives, both in economic positions in the business, but also in political positions, a predator confronts a hydra-like animal, one with many heads. To kill off the head will not necessarily kill the animal, and moreover, multiple heads can grow back in its place. A second means through which these businessmen form ties with society is through, as I mentioned, distributing some of their wealth to their constituents. That is to say, building bridges, building roads, giving charity to local organizations, promoting the interests of local people and local governments. By gaining respect and clout amongst the population, businessmen could then, and this happened, mobilize or threaten to mobilize these people in the form of protests in support of their interests. So, in sum, these elite-level patronage connections are not necessarily sufficient condition for securing property. In fact, these social ties that businessmen form add an extra layer of protection that raises the cost of asset grabbing and property redistribution in different ways. Broadly, this was the type of bargain and the situation that emerged under Akayev. What happened under Bakiev after the revolution in 2000, or the change of power in 2005? I'm happy to talk more about the particularities of the causes of this change in power in 2005, what has been termed an electoral revolution or a color revolution, in the question and answer if you'd like, and also the particular role of bazaar owners and traders. But what I want to focus on now is what we can learn from this new presidential regime from 2005 to 2010 about business-state relations. So I've already mentioned that there were certain continuities between these presidential families, that is, Akayev and Bakiev, the way that they amassed resources and the types of property redistributions that continued in both time periods. But more specifically, what happened to the businessmen that arose under Akayev? What does the Bakiev period tell us about the types of patronage bargains and the strength of this particular informal institution? My answer is, and I've found, that it depends on which of two groups the Akayev-led businessmen fall into. And there were two that I want to focus on, the nomenclatura-based businessmen and businessmen from the sports community. Let me elaborate. The businessmen from the nomenclatura category are people who during the Soviet period were in the Komsomol, in the MVD, KGB, and various security services or local governments, and successfully converted their Soviet economic and political positions into economic opportunities after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Bazaar owners in the second category and the other category are former sportsmen. That is to say, they were athletes, highly revered during the Soviet period, who had control over the use of force, and who, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of funding for state-sponsored sports programs, converted their status into racketeers and then business leaders in the 90s. Businessmen from both of these groups, as I have already discussed, entered politics, became members of parliament, and forged these patronage bargains with the elite as well as with their constituencies. Now, in the months and years following March 2005, the number of contract killings and violent assassinations exploded. Over the course of 2 years, between 2005 and 2007, 4 of the 75 members of parliament, all notably from the sportsmen turned businessmen category, were killed and assassinated. 2 of these people in particular had important stakes in the bazaars, and all of the deaths were tied to the increasing assertiveness and power, both political and economic, of this group. And their deaths were part of a broader set of violent property redistributions in Kyrgyzstan after 2005. Now, focusing on this violence, however, elides an important continuity, namely that many of the bazaar owners and businessmen in the other category, the nomenklatura turned businessmen, in fact turned around and formed a very similar patronage bargain with Bakiev and his family. That is to say, the ability for certain businessmen MPs to retain their assets and positions, retain their social bases in society throughout the Akayev and Bakiev period demonstrates continuity in Kyrgyzstan and, in fact, the resilience of these informal institutions and bargains that businessmen developed in the first period. Thus, while there was violent property distribution, while Bakiev kind of used force more willingly than Akayev, for this other community and subgroup of business owners and bazaar owners, the underlying nature of the bargain and the social networks continued and in a certain sense explains their success throughout the entire period. So to conclude, what I want to do is draw out the 5 implications of my analysis, briefly, taking into consideration most recent events in the country. The first is, what does this study say about how we understand Kyrgyzstan as a country? My work adopts a political economy approach, instead of a more regime change, democratization, authoritarian approach to the study of this country. And it focuses on how actors respond, adapt, and even succeed in this changing and unstable environment. So this approach helps us shed light both on political conflicts in the country, which are often driven by personalized disputes over economic assets, but it also sheds light onto political and important continuities as well. Second, implications for the study of property and property conflict in particular in Kyrgyzstan. So I've argued that while the presidents, whether Akayev or Bakiev, clearly practiced non-meritocratic and family-based appointments, at least until last year, you've seen a diverse group of people from different regions, ethnicities, and clans in the business sector in Kyrgyzstan. They did have certain things in common, however, and that included a certain social status under the Soviet period as nomenklatura or sportsmen, and good ties initially with the Akayev period, with the Akayev president. The caveat here is that in the aftermath of ethnic rioting in the summer of 2010, there have been disturbing reports that primarily ethnic Uzbeks in the south have been forced to sell or abandon their property. And we could talk more about that later, but in a certain sense, this shows that property redistributions are continuing, but there may be a new ethnic dimension to these redistributions, or a more blatant ethnic dimension that we've seen in the past. Third, implications for understanding politics in Kyrgyzstan, more generally. The question that comes to mind is whether this new parliament and new government will be able to stabilize the situation and change the dynamics that I've described that emerged over the past 20 years. While it's perhaps too early to tell, in fact, the government's only been in power for the last 2 months, and presidential elections are set for this coming October, there are reasons to believe that the oligarchic, patronage-based politics established under Akayev and Bakiev will continue to dominate under the guise of this new formal institutional political structure. There are reports suggesting that the cost of a position on one of the party lists in advance of the parliamentary elections in last year costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, suggesting that business is clearly interested and tied to politics, and that the nature of the patronage bargain seems to be intact. Again, the exception here is ethnic Uzbek businessmen who have many of whom have fled or gone into hiding after the violence of last summer. Another continuity is the familial linkages that I was mentioning earlier. They continue to pervade Parliament. So there are many members of the current Parliament who have been in Parliament in the past, many of whom are businessmen, or they're relatives of people who have been in the Parliament earlier. And again, I can give you some examples later. What my research suggests is that we need to understand who seeks power and why they do so, and this leads to greater insights into the informal or unwritten logic of political power in Kyrgyzstan and leads to sobering prospects for the new potential government and political system to function as it's intended. Fourth, implications for the study of political economy more generally and property rights. So these informal patronage bargains may help certain businessmen. They allow them to succeed and even thrive in this environment. However, for the economy more broadly, they perpetuate a largely informal and non-transparent system. In this regard, it would be a mischaracterization, I think, to view these high-level bazaar owners and other businessmen as beacons of hope, demanding reform of state institutions or the creation of formal property rights. Again, this could change in the current government, but what we do know historically is that building national markets and promoting economic development require the eradication of local strongmen and economic elites who control urban and rural fiefdoms. And the fact is the continuing entrenchment of these elites, for example, Salambekov, the owner of the Dordoy Bazaar I mentioned, his brother is in the current parliament. So the continuing entrenchment of the elites and their followers and the absence of an effective state bureaucracy and a state vision suggest a somewhat neo-feudal future for Kyrgyzstan. So to the extent that these businessmen continue to flourish in this environment, send their profit overseas, and remain patrons to these societal groups, I think the country will continue to be fractured, divided, and weak. Finally, the last implication or suggestion I would like to make for my study is that we put Kyrgyzstan in a broader comparative perspective, not only with other post-Soviet countries, but with other developing countries. I think Kyrgyzstan can best be described as an oligarchic patrimonial system. Oligarchic because the country is ruled by competing families, or at least has been until recently, and patrimonial because it's based on patronage relations. So in this type of a system, there is an economic base that is somewhat independent of the state apparatus, but the state plays a central role in the process of wealth accumulation. In that the oligarchic business people extract privilege from this kind of weak or incoherent bureaucracy. It's also an economy that is increasingly criminalized, that is influenced by the continuation of drug flows from Afghanistan and other illicit commodities. I've focused mostly on consumer goods, the trade of licit goods, but there is a whole dimension of illicit goods that travel through Kyrgyzstan. Members of parliament and other officials with known criminal pasts are active in politics and parliament. Some of them have won broad support amongst their constituents. And at the same time, they command control over youth, sportsmen youth, and armed youth that they can mobilize in support of their interests. This is a dangerous trend, one that puts Kyrgyzstan in the same country as perhaps other parts of the developing world, whether parts of India or Philippines, where criminal MPs and local bosses have become important and powerful members of the political scene. So with that, I'll be happy to take your questions.
Okay, I want to begin perhaps with a more theoretical question. I mean, and I'm sure there'll be questions specifically about Kyrgyzstan. But Regine, as I listen to you speak, I'm taken back to a number of debates 20 years ago about the emergence of markets. And there was a school of thought that ultimately you have to create property, and it doesn't really matter how you create that property, that the property owners will, over time, develop an interest in formalizing institutions which will protect their property through the emergence of a set of rules of the game, and that's basically how formal legal structures and institutions will emerge, which will protect the market. And therefore, what's important is to get those first property owners up and running, and then the logic of the system will demand the emergence of institutions. There was another position, and I think you're kind of coming closer to it, which is, no, the initial rules of the game really matter, because if informal arrangements dominate over formal arrangements, it's a system which will perpetualize itself and will not create formal, there's no incentive to create formal institutions. If indeed that is what you're saying, where are there points at which the process of formalization can begin? What are the kinds of interventions that would be necessary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important question. And I do think that I'm coming from that second body of literature that suggests that certain types of patronage networks and rules of the game that predated, in fact, the independence of this country came to dominate. What I'd like to say is that my study and this particular work has focused on very high-level business politics relations. That's not to say, though, that there isn't a lot going on at different levels with, for example, the creation of titles and deeds and property certificates for example, at the level of the housing market. So I did visit the Gosregister, which is the state property agency in Kyrgyzstan, and it was packed. And it was packed with everyday people who were registering their property or trying to rectify certain problems with their certificates. And while I haven't done a comprehensive study on this, my sense is that those are the areas that are changing very, very rapidly. People want to have formal ownership of their property. They want to get it registered. They recognize that this is important. And the system is changing more and more to recognize that. That said, of course, the Gosregister has also been highly controversial because of some of the potential scandals involving the sale of other property, for example, at Isikul, to investors in less than transparent ways. So I guess what I'm saying is, and I also didn't talk about small businesses. I was focusing mostly on the kind of big business, the bazaar owners and other businessmen with large stakes in the economy. But as we know from research in Russia, for example, the role of smaller businesses and unions protecting small businesses can be very influential in pressing, for example, for reform of the tax code or other such institutions. So I think what I would say is we need to look at the level of small business or property owners of homes to see where those pressure points are coming from, and that maybe looking below from society is the best place to look for that.
Okay. Will? We got lots of questions.
Just to follow up on that last point, Regine, in terms of small business, are the traders considered small business people? And to what extent are the traders who find themselves in these big bazaars, to what extent do they assert their rights? Are they a force of potential change as well?
Well, what's interesting about the traders, and there are a lot of them, especially at some of these big wholesale bazaars, is that one of the reasons they operate in the bazaar and not, for example, in their own shop in downtown Bishkek is because it's more advantageous for them to do so. And what does that mean? That means that in the bazaar, especially in the ones that are stable and have clear ownership structures, the owners essentially protect the traders from all of the other state agencies that can legitimately come or illegitimately come and collect rents from them. So what you have in Kyrgyzstan and other of these post-Soviet countries is if you own a small shop, the tax person comes to you, the property inspector, the architectural inspector, the health inspector, they come to your business and they basically take bribes. What I found in the bazaars, especially, as I said, in the big wholesale bazaars and some of the more stable ones, is that you don't have that type of extortion, essentially. And the traders can operate much more efficiently by getting their single combined license tax certificate, which is called a patent, which is a type of both license and tax that the government created in 1996 to formalize, at least to some extent, all of the informal transactions that were going on at the level of traders. So traders have this patent, and they are essentially shielded from the rest of the bureaucracy. And in that way, I think that's one of the reasons why the bazaars have been so successful. I mean, in addition to the other macroeconomic trade policies, both of the Kyrgyz government but also of the neighboring governments. So to the extent that, let's say, traders can be a force for change, in a certain sense, I think they're quite happy with their arrangement. And there was some talk when I was there of having them have, for example, formal property ownership of the little plot of land they have on the bazaar. Now that would allow them to have more credit opportunities. So they do get credit opportunities now because some of them own the containers and they have a turnover, so they can demonstrate that, or they have an apartment at home that they can use. But my understanding was that, and you can imagine it's not in the interest of the bazaar owners to let individual traders kind of privatize their particular plot of land. So that, from what I can tell, has gone nowhere. So it is still the bazaar owners that own the land on which the bazaars rest. And to some extent, I think the traders themselves are pretty happy with both a stable environment and protection from the rest of the bureaucratic structures.
A couple of things. One, for people here who have not been to a post-Soviet bazaar, can you explain your repeated reference to container?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So that's an important point. So initially, these bazaars were on tables, stands. Even people would drive up with their cars and put goods on the ground, on blankets. Over time, you saw this phenomenon called the containerization of bazaars. And this is not only true of Kyrgyzstan, but other countries across Central Asia. I was definitely in Kazakhstan in bazaars where I saw this. And what that means is that you have shipping containers, physical shipping containers, that are used as both the storage units and the sales units of these bazaars. And they were brought in different phases throughout the 1990s. Some of them came from China or from East Asia as materials were going into, for example, Uzbekistan in the south of the country to develop the Daewoo car manufacturing plant. I talked to some local businessmen in the south, in Osh and Kyrgyzstan, who said that they got into this business of buying the shipping containers. So they came from China or they came from Korea. They unloaded their stuff for those manufacturing plants, and it was actually more expensive to send them back. So they just bought them, put them in the bazaars, and then it becomes a convenient sales place, but it also becomes a storage unit. It's a big metal box, so it's hard to loot that or steal that. And now in many of the wholesale bazaars, you have double-decker container bazaars. So that is, they sell from the bottom container, and the second container is like the storage unit. So that's how bazaars look. And this is primarily for wholesale bazaars. Retail bazaars are still mostly tables and pavilions.
We have a half dozen questions,
Yeah.
so I'm going to take the gentleman in the back and Thomas. We'll come up here, and then we'll go down here.
Thank you, Regine. Jeff Goldstein from the Open Society Institute.
Hi, Jeff.
Last spring, one of the big issues that brought people out into the street was concern about corruption and lack of transparency. And the new government, I think, in reaction, has talked a lot about increasing transparency. They've got a new initiative in the fuel sector. They've said, for example, that property that was nationalized from the Bakievs will be reprivatized through an open tender process. Based on your research, what recommendations would you have to the government in efforts to provide greater transparency over the economy and some of these unwritten deals that you discussed? And secondly, I know there's a lot of concern in the bazaar sector, particularly the wholesale bazaar sector in Kyrgyzstan, about the impact of Kyrgyzstan being left outside of the customs union and how much this will hurt the re-export business. Given your thoughts on the future just of the bazaars in Kyrgyzstan, is this an institution that maybe has passed its peak?
Before you answer, let's get Thomas on the table. Put your hand up, Thomas, so we can recognize you. Thanks.
My name's Thomas Grindley. Do they have public companies in Kyrgyzstan whose shares are traded in a stock exchange?
Okay, why don't we take these questions?
Okay, great. So let me take the issue of the customs union first, and then I'll move backwards. The customs union is an important question that either way, I would say, dramatically affects Kyrgyzstan and the bazaars, whether Kyrgyzstan joins or not. So the background for this is that there have been multiple attempts to create some type of economic union in the post-Soviet region. In the early 90s, there were attempts. I won't go through the history, but the most recent incarnation of this has been the new customs union attempt in 2006, uniting Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The idea here is, I think the grand vision is kind of some kind of European Union type customs model, but the reality is that many of the countries are not part of it, and it's still very contentious in terms of who will join it and who will not. And one of the countries for whom this is a big decision is Kyrgyzstan. So the first point is that I think one of the most important points is that in the bazaar sector, much of the reason for the kind of thriving of the bazaar is not because it provides commodities for the domestic population, but because it serves as a re-export platform of Chinese goods to Kazakhstan, Russia, to other countries. So the most recent analysis I've read suggests that because Kyrgyzstan is a member of the World Trade Organization, which it joined in 1998, and has among basically the lowest rates, tariff rates across the region, averaging 5%, joining the customs union would actually double the customs rates on average to 10%, which would dramatically impact the profitability of these re-exports and the ability for institutions like Dordoy to survive. There are a host of other reasons why I think joining the customs union would actually negatively impact the country in light of the fact that it's already a member of the WTO and it's already formed. It has other laws, for example, the 2004 law that weighs goods by, or charges customs duties by weight and not by value, which has been an important reason why, again, Kyrgyz traders and Kyrgyz bazaars have been able to compete with their neighbors. In other words, why they're able to import more cheaply and make a profit off the re-export. So given that, I think there are these economic analyses that suggest that while there may be certain benefits, others, especially for the bazaars, the bazaar owners, will be particularly detrimental. And beyond that, I think it becomes a political question of whether or not Kyrgyzstan joins. Kyrgyzstan is a tiny economy compared to the other three. The politics of who decides and who dictates the terms of the customs union will largely be driven by Russia or the three other countries. So more than that, I can't necessarily predict how it will go, but I can say that for sure the bazaars will be impacted, and they were already impacted by the border closures earlier after the events of April and then the rioting in the summer. When the borders close, the bazaars, the turnover in bazaars goes down 60%, really significant amounts. So I think it's a big question mark as to whether or not these bazaars can continue in the form that they've existed over the past 20 years. On the question of transparency, Oh, the caveat here is Uzbekistan. I think there might be a big difference between looking at bazaars such as Dordoy in the north that primarily service the northern markets, such as Kazakhstan and Russia, and then Karasu in the south, which primarily services Uzbekistan. To the extent that the customs union doesn't impact, for example, trade relations between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, you might see a very differential impact on the wholesale bazaars. On the issue of transparency and corruption, yes, there has been a lot of talk by the new administration about anti-corruption measures, about transparency, about even Babanov himself has led an initiative to try and get more foreign direct investment and stimulate the economy. Babanov was also one who, he's a member of parliament now, and in a top official in government. He initiated a law on inspections earlier, again, trying to promote the role of business. But in the past, these initiatives have not brought much. And I would say competing with these initiatives to bring more transparency, reduce corruption, there are also elements within society, especially in the south of the country, that are tied to the criminal networks. And there are people in those circles who thrive off of essentially the informal economy or the lack of a central state to control the situation. I can talk more about the fact that some of these criminals / businessmen / bazaar owners were killed throughout the 2000s, and new people are emerging that I would say kind of challenge this attempt to create a more transparent and non-corrupt society. And the most clear example of that is in Otunbayeva's statements herself, that this anti-criminal, anti-corrupt these groups need to be uprooted. So I guess what I'm saying is, in addition to formal policy measures to increase transparency, there is a subgroup of traffickers and networks, especially in the south of the country, that thrive off of this non-transparent kind of corrupt system. So that, I think, is the real challenge for how to address that, and how to especially bring in foreign direct investment and other sources of capital into a country that's been perceived as wholly unstable over the past year.
And quickly on the stock exchange.
On the stock exchange, I'd like to answer that. Can I get back to you on that question on the stock exchange?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. We have four questions and 8 minutes. So everybody gets one question, and I'll take them all at once, and you get to answer quickly. So,
Okay, great.
Right here.
David Fishman, visiting scholar SAIS. To what extent have courts become relevant to resolving disputes between merchants and bureaucrats in terms of formality, predictability?
Okay. We're moving up this way, Ross, so Boris is next.
Hi, I'm Boris Lanin. Is that true that Uzbek businessmen became more successful in Kyrgyzstan than the Kyrgyz ones? And if it's so, why did it happen?
Right here.
Very interesting presentation. How would you interpret this latest modernization of bazaar's infrastructure and architecture? Is it a response to the traders' demands, or it's purely business move or something else? Thanks.
Okay, and right here.
You spoke of the access that people had to the center and to seeking privileges. What about access to the use informally of the enforcement mechanisms of the system to do the type of inspections that you were referring to and harass and cheapen assets so assets can be taken over?
Okay. Four different questions.
Yes, great. Okay, so I'll just take them in order. Courts, very interesting also. In my research, it was clear that there were certain groups of people who did try to go through the court system, for example, to claim their ownership of the bazaar. And in particular, the people who worked in the trade unions during the Soviet period who had shares in the bazaar were essentially disenfranchised in the 90s and tried to use the court system to get their shares back from these other businessmen who took over. In that particular instance, what I can say is while the courts have been used, they've not been the definitive source of conflict resolution. And what I mean by that is that you have these ongoing cycles of court cases. So one court will decide something, it'll get bumped up to the next level. The next level will either, confirm it or say that there was some procedural problem, and it will get bumped somewhere else, and it keeps, going through this cycle of essentially indecision. That said, there is research, again, from the Russia case. I'm not aware that there is systematic research in Kyrgyzstan on this, but there is research in the Russia case that courts are increasingly being used and that they're increasingly being effective at resolving disputes. And I think that is an important area to watch. But again, I haven't seen any of this research from Kyrgyzstan in particular. The second question on why are Uzbeks more successful in business and why? Historically in the region, which is a segment of what my research addresses, Uzbeks and other settled people have played a dominant role in trade and merchant culture. If you think of the historic Silk Road, the cities you think of, such as Samarkand and Bukhara, are in modern-day Uzbekistan and not Kyrgyzstan. So it's interesting that Kyrgyzstan, in fact, has, there's nomadic people who have historically not only not played a huge role in trade, but have, in a certain sense, shunned trade, or there have been all these negative associations around Kyrgyz and Kazakhs being traders, have become the dominant force of trade in the region. So what I would say to that is the context for Kyrgyz becoming traders and ethnic Kyrgyz here I'm talking about, and bazaar owners as well, originates in the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s and the economic crisis and the social crisis that faced everyday people, whether Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Dungan. And that many of the Kyrgyz traders started out precisely because they had no other economic opportunities, and they learned the trade. They had to come over stereotypes not only about speculation, but about, their own histories or backgrounds of not trading at the bazaars, but buying from the bazaars. And in fact, if you look even at, for example, the bazaars in Kyrgyzstan, even Osh Bazaar in Osh, it was predominantly Uzbek, so 60% Uzbek, but there were 40% Kyrgyz traders before it was looted and closed after the June events of last year. So, and in Dorloy Bazaar, 70% of the traders are ethnic Kyrgyz. So there are a lot of Kyrgyz who are traders. There was, however, evidence and this idea that the Uzbeks did dominate in certain commercial sectors, especially in the south of the country, and that the Kyrgyz were dominant in the police forces and other government forces, and so there was that divide, and that kind of was part of the backdrop of the tensions that you saw. But that's kind of some historical background for why there's a perception that Uzbeks have been in trade and merchant culture, but the reality is that both in the 90s, but also increasingly today, there are more and more Kyrgyz who are in this sector. Modernization demands at the bazaars. So what's interesting now is that there have been a slew of press reports, particularly about the central retail bazaar in Osh, but also about other bazaars. And you saw this in Kazakhstan as well. I was doing field research in Kazakhstan in 2006, 2007, and they are definitely driven by the government, in my opinion, by the local governments. So, in fact, so the idea is that trade in many of these bazaars, especially the retail bazaars, emerged rather spontaneously. That is, people came either to existing bazaars or started new bazaars and just started trading, and all of a sudden you had these bazaars. So traffic was obstructed, whole new kind of pavilions were established like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and the central tension, I think, one central tension for state authorities, in addition to figuring out how to formalize this sector and extract revenues, is how to make the bazaars conform to some type of kind of non-chaotic urban landscape. So what I mean by that is these recent proposals from the local government in Bishkek are trying to essentially close certain parts of the bazaars, rebuild, reconstruct, modernize bazaars, and it's unleashed a huge amount of protest from the traders. And you saw this too in Kazakhstan when they were trying to close or change some of the big bazaars there. There were all these plans drafted. I saw them, like big, ritzy, basically malls, to convert bazaars into modern shopping malls. It was the vision and is the vision, I think. But I think, again, there are two things. One, the traders are very resistant to this because often it implies that they will have to pay more, for example, for their rents or for their business. And two, this often takes place against the backdrop of some type of ownership struggle that's going on behind the scenes. And I can't say in particular what's going on now in the case of Osh Bazaar, but I know that in the past in other bazaars, modernization attempts were coincided with behind the scenes property redistributions. So that would be something I would want to know in the current situation. Finally, access. Can you repeat your question for me? Something access to inspections.
Access to the enforcement mechanisms.
Oh, enforcement mechanisms. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the informal use of it.
So you mean how do traders or how do business people try to prevent this type of
not prevent, but
okay.
to the players in the system
Oh.
get access to the formal enforcement mechanisms for private use?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so yes, the answer is yes. So I think that one of the reasons, for example, that these businessmen want to become members of parliament is because not only do they have access to the top leadership for kind of other types of expropriation bargains or security bargains, but they also get access to top levels of, let's say, the customs officials or the tax officials. And I know in the case of certain bazaar owners who were members of parliament, they would exercise their status as members of parliament and their access to these top officials to, for example, let certain groups of cargo or cargo shipments pass through. And those bargains happen at the very, very highest levels. So I do think that there are important ties between businessmen and these enforcement leaders. And the other point is in terms of the drug trafficking, if you want to talk about the illicit side of things, apparently many of the police officers in the South are intimately tied to the drug trafficking. And it's largely through them that it happens. So.
Well, Regine, thank you. This is interesting for lots of reasons, both for what it has to say about Kyrgyzstan and former Soviet space, but more generally. And clearly there are places in the world where bazaars have been converted into markets, usually with partnership with local authorities. But I think any of us, and we can think of examples. I know at one point when I was studying immigrants in Ukraine, I got to know a little bit something about markets in Ukraine. And what's very interesting is in Kharkiv, there was a kind of formalization and modernization of the markets, in part, not totally, but in part because local authorities were more open to immigrants and actually worked with them to some extent, whereas in Kiev, local authorities just viewed immigrant markets as a place to plunder, and modernization didn't happen. So maybe someplace in there is the answer to the question: is this the nascent formation of a formalized market economy, or is it just another landscape of plunder? So thank you for raising these questions and for giving us some hints at answers, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you all for coming.